as well, always. I know I have these ideas, and then a few minutes after before, I regret them. Hi everyone, welcome back to Membrain. Today is all about writing scientific papers with Alice and Alan. These two fantastic guests, Alice and Alan, are readers in biochemistry at Aston University in Birmingham, UK. They have extensive experience in publishing scientific papers, and today we are going to tap into their knowledge to learn more about the world of academic publishing. Hi, Alan. Hi, Alice.
Hello.
Thank you very much for being here today. So, what do you think about publishing in academia? What is your opinion about the pressure that we have to publish frequently?
There's that kind of old academic saying, is there, which is publish or perish, which is still kind of true in that publication is kind of the academic currency, where it shows that you're active in a field, you're doing research that's worth publishing and hopefully worth citing by other people. There's always pressure to do it, but sometimes not as much pressure as other parts of the job, for me at least. So sometimes I fall behind on publications, I'd say. The other pressure is to get it out for PhD students and postdocs because they need that to advance their career. So you need it for your career, but you also need it for the people in your lab. So you've got the kind of that almost moral duty to make sure you get people publications.
I think there's always that battle between, do you hold off for a higher impact paper or do you publish what you've got now because you've got it and it's good to go and the student needs the paper. So it's always a balance in that.
My PhD supervisor used to joke about the minimal publishable unit. So it's the smallest amount of data you need to get a paper out of it. And I've got one of those for my PhD with the smallest amount of data. It's got a single figure in it. But then if you want to get a higher impact paper, it might take years. But then there's the challenge of things have changed a lot in the last 20 years. When I was a PhD student, you used to publish in a journal because your library physically got that journal, and you could go to the journal and you could open the hard copy of the journal, look through what was in there, and it was your field, for example, molecular microbiology. Now everything's online. The journal's sometimes slightly less important, I think, in terms of getting your work out there because people find it regardless. It's not like they're only reading Nature, Science, and their specialist journal. If you publish it in the unknown journal of biochemistry research and it's on PubMed, people still find it.
So do you think that at this point, at this stage of your career, you don't feel a lot of pressure to publish, but in the beginning of the career of anyone in academia, working in academia, there's a lot of pressure?
I don't know. I think in my PhD and my postdoc, I was driven by my supervisors to write papers, and it was exciting, and I didn't feel it as a pressure.
Okay.
And then when I first became an academic, I wanted to because I really wanted that first last author paper.
Okay.
I don't think I ever really felt it as a pressure, but then that's because I like writing papers. It's easier than writing grants for me, and so for me it was never the pressure. Writing grants was always the pressure.
I think you've got so many parts in your job as an academic. The pressure comes on the bit that you either don't want to do or want to do less than the other bits, because the bits of your job that you really enjoy doing are not pressure at all. And the bits of your job that either you don't enjoy as much or you find lower priority, you've got to kind of make yourself do those things. And I think that's where the pressure comes from.
But to publish the papers, we need data and we need the work. And so that increases the pressure, and also because, so when I talk with other PhD students or people working in academia, they often ask, oh, how many papers do you have? Did you publish in your PhD? Actually, there are some countries and universities that you cannot finish your PhD without publishing. It was not the case here at Aston, but there's this pressure, and this is awful because you need the data, you need the work, but you have like just a specific amount of time of your PhD. So they feel this pressure. They have this pressure.
But I think that can lead to poor publications sometimes, because if you've got to publish a set number of papers, you go back to that minimal publishable unit, don't you? Where you say, I've got this great story and I can either publish it as one paper or I can publish it as 3 papers, and I need 3 to get my PhD. So I'm going to publish it as 3 papers. And maybe it's better as one more concise, more kind of impactful story. But I think it is good to have PhD students at least thinking about publishing. And I'd hope all my PhD students will get at least one first author paper out of their project. And then that keeps my publications ticking along as well.
I think sometimes it takes a long time as well, though, because although I would say that pretty much all of my PhD students usually get a first author paper from it, sometimes it can be a few years after they've graduated by the time it's published.
Yeah, that's another problem.
Because you need, like you said before, you need the data. And I think the real pressure in science is getting the data. Once you've got the data, that sets you up to write grants, it sets you up to write papers. So the pressure really is on the people in the lab like you.
Exactly. Thank you. But yeah, and after you finished your PhD, to apply for another job, many times they ask for the papers, and again we feel this pressure. Actually, I was recently on LinkedIn and I saw this image of two scientists, one representing the 19th century scientist and another image of another scientist representing the 21st century scientist. And the 19th century scientist was saying, I must find the explanation for this phenomenon in order to truly understand nature. And the more recent scientist, the 21st century scientist, was saying, I must get the result that fits my narrative so I can get my paper into Nature. What do you think about these differences, these mindset differences?
I think it's not how I would work. I think you get the data and then you base the story based on the data. And you set off with an idea about something that's going to be really exciting and cool. And then maybe it turns out a different way. So if we take your PhD project as an example, the idea was to take Clostridia that make butanol and to engineer their cell membrane to make them more resistant to butanol. And we did that. But inadvertently on the way through, spoilers about Carolina's PhD, they no longer make butanol, so they're useless for the original purpose. And we've learned a lot about science on the way, but we can't now go with the original idea and say we want to publish it because the data doesn't support that. You should only publish what your data supports.
Yeah, I sometimes think the whole hypothesis-driven research is sometimes pushed too far. Like, I always think of it as I have a question I'd like to answer, and then let's do the experiments to try and answer that question, and then we get the results, and then we can try and interpret them and figure out what they mean, rather than starting with a hypothesis and then the results prove your hypothesis right or wrong. I don't really like that approach. I like the open-minded, we've got an interesting question we want to find out about, and let's do what we can to find some answers.
And do you think that way it's easier to have a better data and maybe keep going with the funding? So
I think it's easier to have a continuing story that way. So I don't know, I don't work in clinical trials, but let's say you do a clinical trial and it doesn't work. That's kind of the end of it, right? If we make a Clostridial strain that doesn't make butanol but has an interesting membrane composition, more resistant, that's not the end of that story. You can then do more things with that, and you can use it as a basis for a grant application, for example, to say we know something about improvement, we want to make it even better by these ways. So I think doing science that doesn't have a single endpoint is quite important to me, where you can always take it in another direction. We always talk about individual experiments and say, do experiments that tell you something, whether they give you result A or result B. Try not to do experiments where it's the endpoint and it doesn't tell you anything if it doesn't work or doesn't give you the result you expected.
There used to be a thing as well when I was younger, the pressure that if you got negative results, you couldn't publish them. But I don't think that's true. I think the field needs to know so that they don't waste time and resources doing the same thing.
But can we publish results, negative results?
How you frame it.
Okay, how you frame it. Okay.
Yeah. So it's never going to be a high impact paper, but I do think that you can show results that didn't give the answer you maybe expected or were hoping for or thought. I think it is possible, yeah.
And I think with something like Alice's work, where she's looking at novel polymers to extract membrane proteins, you could just publish the one that works. But what's more valuable is publishing the one that works and the 15 that don't, for example. And then you can start to work out what about the 15 doesn't make it work. And yeah, if you just stick this nice kind of happy, clappy, positive storyline where you started off with this hypothesis, you did this experiment and it proved it, it leaves an awful lot of stuff that you never publish that people waste their time repeating. No, and you only learn it by going to a conference, for example, and somebody presents their honest version of it with all the warts and stuff and says that this stuff didn't work.
Yeah, that's true. It actually was very important for me when I was writing my thesis, and I found some papers where they tried to knock out and silence the same genes that I was doing, and they mentioned like we tried all of these and we just were able to successfully do it in only one or two, and it was like really good for me because it's like, oh, this is also happening with us. Maybe the gene is essential. It might be not just a problem of the procedure. It's important to have to be honest. and to share.
The other thing I really like is when you hear that someone else has come along and tried the same experiment and got the same result you did. I love it when that happens.
Yeah, there's very little reproduction in the scientific literature as well, where people say, so it's taken as gospel that if you did something and you've published it, therefore it must be completely accurate. And we all know mistakes happen and things get switched and that kind of stuff. But it is nice to see when somebody else does the same as you and gets at least a similar result, even if it's a related experiment, like a different organism or a slightly different twist. But at least you start to see the patterns in the literature.
The other way around is not cool. When I try to reproduce a protocol from a paper and I don't have the same results.
Yeah, but that's important.
That's horrible.
That could be you. It could be that there's a mistake in the protocol, and I think we need more of that in the field where people say, I tried to do what they did and it didn't work, and then some form of discussion about why it might not have worked, because maybe you're using a different reagent, maybe it's the water in the building you're working in. It's always the water.
That's the only thing we can blame, right?
Or maybe it's the fact that their protocol's got a mistake in it. And I've got a paper where we published an erratum because afterwards somebody emailed me and said, "Are you sure you did that?" And I went, "Oh no, that's out by 1,000-fold." So we had to publish a correction in it that said actually the method was out by 1,000-fold. And that's important to make it reproducible. So you get 2 papers anyway. You get an erratum as well.
It's interesting because every time sometimes I search on the internet like what is the most important bit of a paper when writing a paper, and a lot of people talk about the methodology. But I don't know. Many times as well, we try to reproduce the methodology and we can't. So, what is your why do you think? Do you think that we do it wrong? We should do it better. How can we? Could we do it better?
I think methods are often written with a minimum amount of information you need to reproduce that method. An awful lot of references to as Smith et al. Did 20 years ago. I think the best methods papers are those that are purely methods papers. I don't know if Alice wants to say about that, because we've published a few.
We've done a few where they're actually the whole paper is just about a method. So you give a little intro, then you give the step-by-step protocol and annotate it with tips and tricks and alternatives and things to avoid and stuff like that. That kind of paper is really useful. And there are journals that publish only that kind of paper.
But do you think that in a paper that is not just methodology, in the methods, we could add that as well?
I think it would be too much.
Too much.
Yeah.
It's quite a lot of work to do those. And also it'll make the paper unwieldy long. You may be as a supplementary information, but then the other advantage of doing those methods papers is, again, if you're thinking about the quantity of papers you've got, if you publish a methods paper, you've got another paper.
That's 2 papers.
and they can be quite highly cited because they're important papers in the field, because they tell people exactly how to do stuff. As I said, the tips and tricks, those are really important, because when it says, add solution A to solution B and rock for 20 minutes or whatever, there's a trick in there about what kind of rocker you use or how you add the solution together, whatever, that will help you actually make the protocol work. How
easy do you think it is to publish that kind of papers?
Normally done by invitation, aren't they?
Yeah.
So normally there'll be a method. So there's a journal called Methods, for example, or Methods in whatever. And they would commission an editor to bring together a load of people in the field to write it. So we've got one that we did around membrane protein methods. And so basically I was going to our mates and saying, "You're an expert in this, can you write a methods paper on how to do it?" So if you're invited to do them, very easy, because they're very rarely rejected, because you write it and the editor says, "Do these tweaks," and then it's accepted. So that's good. But it's about networking, really, about people knowing that you are a relative expert on this thing that they want to talk about.
Although I've never done it, I know quite a few people quite like the Jove ones as well, where you make a video of your method and stuff.
Okay, that's interesting. That's actually
is it star methods as well now?
That's
had a star
thing.
Methods one, yeah.
So I think that's normally linked to a paper. So when you've had a regular paper, if there's a particular method in it you want to highlight or that's new or something, then you can have like an attached thing about that focuses on the method.
That's very important. So writing and submitting a scientific paper is hard, and it takes a lot of time. For some people, I know that Alice, you love doing it.
I do like writing papers,
which is amazing. So imagine you have the results ready for a paper, but you only have a blank Word document. What would be your advice, like how to start and how to do it in a more efficient way, write it in the efficient way?
So I always start by making the figures. because I think that's the most important thing, collating the data, not just having the data in your Excel files and whatever, but collating it together, figuring out which bits to put together in a figure, in what way. So I always start by making the figures. And for each figure, I don't start by writing a figure legend. I just write a take-home message of the point I want to make with that figure. And I actually do that in PowerPoint, like one slide per figure, until I've got all of them sorted. And then what that does is that sets up your results for you, because then you know what the story is in your head that you want to tell, you know what order it's going to go in, you know what bits are in what figure. So then I always start writing with the results. And I think that's the easiest place to start, because it's the bit you know best, right? You've done the experiments, or you've supervised someone doing the experiments, and you've just figured out the story with the figures. So I write the results first. And then I'll go back and write the introduction, because now I know what I want to introduce. And then I'll write the discussion. I mean, methods is easy. You can write that when you're not thinking. It can go first, last, whenever. Like, that's the one that, I don't know, it's a bit more boring to write, I think, but like it's quite easy, good to fill in small gaps and stuff. But the bulk of the paper, I would do results, then the intro, then the discussion.
I think the story is important. A good paper has a story behind it that says, you know, this is the open question in the field. This is what we did to try and address that. This is the outcome, which may or may not address it to a certain extent. And then a discussion that says, you know, this is how we add value to the scientific literature and how we compare to it. And I write in a similar way, which actually I did steal off Alice, so I give her credit for that. The other thing I'd say is write the abstract last.
Okay.
Because then you've written the whole paper and you know what you write the abstract about. Otherwise, you write the abstract about what you think you're going to write about. And then either that shapes how you try and write and the paper doesn't turn out how it should turn out, or you have to go back and rewrite it then anyway.
Do you know who's great at abstract? Rosalind.
Okay.
She's really good at writing an abstract.
Summarizing data,
Yeah.
it's really hard.
But also making your abstracts so it sounds interesting and important. So there's a process in the UK called REF, Research Excellence Framework, where all of our papers get scored on a scoring system between 1 and 4 star about how good they are on various metrics. And obviously it's a very in-depth process where people read your papers carefully, but a lot of it in essence comes down to how your abstract's written. So does your abstract have that novelty and that real importance in it? So make sure your abstract doesn't fade away into, for example, for your paper that we're writing now about your PhD, it would be easy to say at the end, oh, but it didn't really work, and you know the cells don't make any butanol, isn't that a bad thing? But you can set it in a more positive light by saying something like, membrane engineering is clearly really complex, but we've now made strains where you can influence a membrane composition, and now we need to understand how we tweak them so that they can produce butanol but also be more tolerant. And then you know you can it sells your paper in a different way. Nobody wants to read a paper that goes, oh, that's a bit rubbish.
Yeah, and it can also, we could prove that we can change the membrane, the lipid composition in the membrane, and now it's just playing with it and see what we can do with it. Maybe it's not for butanol, or maybe it's for butanol in a different strategy, or for other things like recombinant proteins. Or okay, so that was the question I was going to ask after that is like from the abstract to the conclusion. So first the results, then introduction, and then conclusion, and abstract at the end, and ask Rosalind.
I think one of the more challenging sections to write is a discussion, because we write about results all the time. We all know our field well enough to write an introduction. To write a discussion, you've really got to spend a lot of time thinking about how your data fits and reading with how your data fits with the rest of the field. And that's actually one of the important bits of the paper, is the discussion about how have you added that knowledge value to the field. And I think for a PhD student, that's, if you can write a good discussion, that means you know your field really well. Like anybody can write results, because it's kind of describing what the results show. So if you understand the methods, you can kind of describe the results. You can write an introduction by going to a similar paper in the field and going, what have they put in their introduction, and writing it a different way that leads into your story. But writing discussion means you really know the field.
I used to hate the discussion, but now I like it probably the most. I like seeing like where your results fit within the context of the wider literature. I like trying to come up with ideas that might explain what we found and why, and how that fits with what else is known, and hypothesize about where to take it next, that kind of thing. But it is something that's grown with time. When I was at your stage, I hated it.
I underestimate discussion. And I did that when I was writing the thesis. I thought, oh, in 1 week I can write it. No, it took me like I think almost 1 month. And even now for the paper, I was like, oh, maybe I can do this in 1 week. No, because you see the data and it's like, what? How do I like? It's a puzzle, and I have the pieces all over the place, and I need to fit the puzzle to put the puzzle right. It's hard because sometimes we don't know if that piece goes with the other piece or should go with another piece or why this. I don't know. It's hard.
But I think get other people to read your papers as well. So don't necessarily just write your paper, submit it. Get other people to read it and say, your discussion's not really a discussion, or I don't understand what you've written about your results, or send it to Rosalind and say, can you rewrite my abstract for me, please? Here's some sentences.
That's why I send it to you. I send it to you because I know that there's something missing, but having the opinion of another person is important. Like to check, oh, this doesn't make sense. Maybe here we need to understand better. We should read other papers and see if there's any connection. It's hard.
But knowing that something's missing is the first step in working out what you're going to do about it. If you write a paper and you think it's perfect and somebody looks at it and goes, but you're missing all this stuff, that's far worse than sending somebody a draft and saying, I don't know how to get from A to B, I need something in the middle. And then they might have a bright idea about how to do it.
It's important. Okay, and that's good, Alice, that with the time we start enjoying puzzling these jigsaws.
But with time, the literature more as well, and you build upon it. And I don't know, it definitely does get easier with time.
You know what I feel when I'm doing the discussion? Those TV shows like CSI, those where you have like a murder and you have to find who committed the homicide, and you have like that wall with and all the police officers trying to connect the dots with those lines, and I try to imagine that, but I still cannot find.
I think that's quite a good analogy, isn't that? You've got all these disparate bits of information, you're trying to put them together to see how it fits with what you've found and stuff. Yeah.
Well, I try to do that, but I still I miss a bright mind to help me, to guide me. Alan. and then Rosalind. Okay, so we were talking now about the discussion and what is your opinion? Like, what's the most important information to include in each section? Like, as you were saying, abstract is very important. We need to kind of sell our project and make it interesting.
And your abstract has to have something from each section of your paper as well. So some introduction to give you context, the main results, ideally with numbers and stuff if you can get them in there. So you need a method as well. We're trying to investigate X via method Y. We found A, B, and C. Then some discussion. This means so and so. I'm going to change the world.
Yes.
Maybe moderate that last sentence, but your intro should go from the bigger picture. So if we're writing about using Clostridia to make butanol, you can start from the point of saying Clostridia can make butanol, or you can start from the point of saying climate change is really bad. We want to make biofuels to mitigate some of the effects of using petrochemicals, but then kind of narrow it down. It's like an inverted triangle or inverted pyramid. Start with the big picture and come down to what the question in your paper is. So in your case, you can make butanol using Clostridia, but it's toxic. Why is it toxic? It probably affects the membrane. Can you change the membrane to make them more resistant? That's what we're going to do in this paper. And then some introductions end with like a brief summary of what was done. So sometimes people say, in this paper, we show A, B, and C, and some of them just go straight into methods.
Yeah, I think it's important that you capture someone's interest with something general at the start and guide them to what the research gap was. That's a phrase that you often hear. What's the research gap? Why is this paper needed, basically?
And communicating in a scientific paper, it's different than, for example, when we do a presentation, because when we are writing a paper, it's for a specific audience, right? It's for someone that already works in the field, I would say.
It is, but I think more and more with interdisciplinary research, it is important to write in a way that's understandable to someone who's not a precise expert in your field.
Okay.
So going back to discussion, there's quite often inferences and ideas you can draw from relatively disparate fields, but you need to understand the literature they've written about it. So I'm not saying you write it in lay language, but write it in a way that at least it's understandable. And I'd say try and define jargon if you're going to use it, like not every term, but especially when you work across disciplines. Like I've started reading papers about polymer synthesis, and I know nothing about polymer synthesis, and some papers are much better than others because someone explains to me why they're doing stuff, where some will just say, assume that you know all these things.
I think another thing that's important to avoid too much use of is abbreviations. Now, of course, some abbreviations are important because sometimes you can't just write it out every time, but some people abbreviate too many things and it becomes unreadable almost, like if there's too many abbreviations.
I don't. Yeah,
Like,
I struggle with that.
If you think about your paper, for example, you're working on strain that makes 3 different weak acids, right? Some people abbreviate those to like BA through butyric acid. There's no need to do that. You just make people think more than they need to do. A paper should be easy to read. So if it doesn't take forever to type stuff out, maybe just use a full name. Like nobody's going to write deoxyribonucleic acid every time they write DNA, but you don't need to make up your own abbreviations for stuff.
I don't think papers are easy to read. And I remember when I started my undergrad and I had to read the first papers ever, it took me weeks just to understand the introduction. And I was panicking when I was starting the results because, first of all, I'm Portuguese, so English is not my native language, and I struggle a bit with the language. And then it was with those abbreviations, with the way that there's a lot of information in one sentence, and then we read and it's more and more and more new information and I was feeling completely lost. And I still think okay, nowadays it's much easier because with practice it gets easier, but I think it's still complex because we are it's very specific on one thing, and that's, as you said, it's important to communicate it to a broad audience. And
I think you can do that as well by having take-home messages, like Alice was saying when she writes it, she does her figures and has a take-home message from each one. If somewhere near the start of each bit of results you tell people why you did something and what you show, then they might not need the next 6 paragraphs of technical detail, because from their point of view they already know what the take-home message is from that, and none of us are experts in everything. So it's useful to have those brief summaries that say figure X shows blah 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 blah, and then you might go into some more in-depth stuff, but you can almost skip that sometimes and just say, at least I know what it shows now.
Yeah. When I was an undergrad, I was exactly the same. I struggled horrifically to read papers. Like, it took forever. I never quite got it. It was awful. But like you say, it gets easier with time, and it continues to get easier. I can skim read lots of papers now, and still get the key points from them. It's just something that improves the more you do it and gets easier.
And if a paper's got good figures, you almost don't need to read the paper. Yeah. You can look at the figures, you can interpret them yourself and know what the paper is showing, really.
These days, if I'm going to read a paper, I tend to read the abstract and then I jump straight to the figures. And I don't read most of the other text. I want to figure out what the data is showing me, how I interpret it, and then see if that matches up with what they're telling me it does. And that's probably, if I'm in a hurry, that's all I read.
And if you like it, then you read the whole paper,
exactly.
Right? This has to attract your attention.
And it is harder now because there's so much more literature. Like when I did my PhD, I could read all the papers on the thing that I did my PhD on in a few days, probably, to be honest, because there weren't that many. Whereas now, if you take SMALPS as an example, which what Alice worked on, 10 years ago, there were a handful of papers and you could capture the literature in a week. Whereas now it's exponentially grown and there's dozens a day or however many are being published. So it is harder to keep up now. And that's why that's why people need to write clear papers with good summaries so that you know whether you need to read the paper or not.
And something else that I feel very often is that we work in this specific thing that for us is kind of obvious. There are some things that are obvious, but they are not obvious for someone else that is not working with it. And if we don't think about it when we're writing a paper, when you're communicating, they will struggle a lot reading it and analyzing it. And that's why the way you're saying that is important to send a clear message, Clarity is queen, right? Like
That's
Rosalind
what Liz Boss said, yeah.
said last night.
You only
No, it's
need one.
attractive.
You only need one podcast. You just say clarity is attractive, and then you leave it there.
Yeah, and I remember when I was studying on my undergrad, I had to do some reports. So I had to do some experiments and then write a report and then do the bibliography. So I needed papers, and I had a lot of colleagues with a lot of papers in the bibliography, and I was like, how would you read all of these papers and understand? How could you understand all of these papers? I read like 2 or 3, and I'm still struggling with the information. I felt very stupid and dumb, I have to admit.
Yeah, but some people don't really read them. Some people just cite them based on what somebody else said. And that's how problems in the literature start, of people going in and saying, they'll put a statement and they'll have read a review article where they said it's Smith et al. 2009, and they'll cite that without reading it. And it turns out it wasn't Smith et al. 2009 at all who said anything like that. And then it propagates in the literature and it all goes to rubbish.
Yeah.
So you're doing the right thing reading the actual papers.
But do you feel that there's this need of having a huge bibliography, or do you value that more than if you have a paper with less amount of papers?
Relevant bibliography, I would say.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are only 5 papers you need to cite. Sometimes there's 50. So we've just had one of our students write a review article, and there's something like 380 papers he cited in that. But they're all relevant. It's a very broad brush review article. Whereas I've published papers where you might only cite a dozen, 20 papers, because that's what's relevant.
That's another thing, another question that is because, for example, when I was writing my thesis, I realized that some of the results, people were assuming like silencing genes knocking out without sequencing. They were saying like, oh, we found that the strain stopped producing, for example, one lipid based on just one TLC. And I was like questioning myself, like, how can we know that based only in this experiment, the TLC, that lipid is not there anymore? Do you feel like, what do you feel about this?
I'm a big fan of complementary methods. So you do something that shows things in multiple ways to give you that kind of certainty. But part of it will be the review process. So I know we haven't really talked about papers being reviewed, but once you've written it, you submit it to a journal. Somebody like Alice, who has the job of being a journal editor, will find some people to send it out to, who are relative experts in the field, send it out. And it won't always land on the desk of somebody who's an expert in every bit of what you do. And if neither or none of the 3 reviewers, or however many you have, are experts in, for example, TLC or lipid quantification, nobody might pick up that that's problematic during the review process. And obviously it's on the authors to do good science in the first place, but it's also reliant on the reviewers picking stuff like that up. So if you'd have reviewed that paper, you might have said, I don't really think you can just show that off one TLC. Why don't you go away and do some mass spec, for example?
Yeah, but by that time, that was the better technique, right? I would say, like in the 80s, there was not mass spec.
Yeah, but in the 80s, there were probably only 4 papers in the field as well, so people were fine.
That's true.
I think I agree that it's really something that should be picked up by reviewers, but it's challenging to get reviewers at the moment, and so there's no guarantee that would happen. But that is, in theory, the purpose of peer review, is to pick up on things like that. And just, I mean, it might be that they only show one single TLC, but the reviewers should point out that, like, have you got replicates of this? Have you done it more than once at least?
I don't know exactly how it works because I don't have a lot of experience in this. But when we send all the, for example, all the results we have, all the calculations, like all the Excel files, we don't send them this. They don't.
No. So the reviewer gets the paper as you would see it in a journal with that stuff in it.
Okay.
There's a move now to deposit data in a data repository where you would put that underlying Excel files and things in there. And some journals want you to have done that before you submit to journal, and some are okay with you doing it afterwards. So I think there's a move in the field to have more of the data available. So, if say you've done, very technical terms, band densitometry to quantify off TLC, you would publish maybe a graph of the band densitometry or maybe an image of the TLC, but you deposit the data, which is the Excel file with all the band densitometry data in it. But the reviewers get no more than you'd get as a normal read of the paper. That's the point. They're reviewing the thing that you're trying to publish.
I feel like that's a bit scary because I don't know. When I have an Excel file with dozens of numbers, I'm always scared if I missed like one calculation. If there's something sometimes it's just a simple thing, and it changes a lot the results. This is
I think the responsibility for that's with the authors, though. Peer reviewing, I mean, it takes time already. There's no way they would have time to go through and check the data. No way.
so if you
So
want,
it's the responsibility of the people writing the article
And I
to
think if you do
be confident of it. But like Alan said, if in hindsight you do spot something's wrong later, you can contact the journal and let them know.
and it changes.
so you
If
could-
they consider it a big enough deal, they'll publish an erratum.
And do you think so? In that case, it's easy to manipulate the data.
I think that's a big challenge for all sites at the moment, is that people publishing fabricated data or AI generated data or duplicated data. And I get asked to review an awful lot of papers which are essentially identical papers, and they're generally in the field, and this is generalization, of I took X drug and I added it to these cells and that wasn't a great anti-cancer drug. And it's essentially just a journal mill of, here's some figures that are very similar or sometimes the same. Here's some bar charts that show my cells die or don't die. Here's some images of cells. Can I have a paper, please?
I think it's a growing problem, but it's difficult to tackle. Like increasingly, journals require you to submit supplementary files, which include all of your uncropped images. So Western blots is a classic. Often they're cropped down just to show the bands. And there's a lot of move that you have to show the uncropped images in supplementary and replicates and things like that. Journals are trying, but it is a challenge. It's hard to prove malpractice.
Oh, that's scary. Because then we are going to read those papers, and this paper has exactly the result we wanted for our discussion, and that this is like a mess, like a vicious cycle.
But I think you have to be critical when you read the literature, in terms of, like you said, is the way they've done it really proving what they're proving, and to some extent, is it an area that group's got a track record of working on? Have they cited the right literature? Does it agree with the rest of the literature? Is it a rogue result that doesn't really fit?
But again, this is a lot. This is time consuming.
Yeah.
You are very busy. You have a lot of work to do, and you have to publish, and you have to find the money for science. You have to manage students, and the students have to do the experiments. So it's hard to find this balance. So you can actually analyze all the paper, like properly analyze the paper and properly analyze the bibliography from each paper and see if it makes sense. It's I don't know. Is it something feasible?
I think once you know the literature, you know whether it seems a bit odd or not. Once you know the bulk of the literature, you start to spot the things that might not seem quite as right as some of the other things. But it is difficult. It's really hard to detect scientific fraud like that.
Yeah, I mean, the journals, as I said, they're implementing various steps, but there's a limit to what you can achieve realistically. Bear in mind that peer reviewing's done as a goodwill thing. No one gets paid for doing peer review. So there is a limit to how much time and effort people can put in and what you can ask of them. So to a degree, you kind of have to trust people. It's getting harder, but you kind of just have to. I mean, sometimes it becomes obvious when you start reading papers that there's giant flaws in them, and then the reviewers usually pick it up. I think far more papers get rejected than accepted. I would say that as an editor.
That was my next question. And what is your opinion about the journal that you're publishing? Do you think that a better work is going to, or like a better data, or a nicer story is going to a better journal, or
I think nicer stories go to better journals. I think nicer stories and pretty pictures go to better journals. So things that are going to get cited go to better journals. It depends how you define better. So I'm not going to name the one journal, but I named the other one. When I was a postdoc, I tried to publish in what was then considered a very good journal in the field. We sent in the manuscript, and then they sent us back some corrections. We did those, sent it in. They sent us back some corrections, some more experiments. We did basically another paper's worth of experiments. We sent that back in. They asked for some more stuff. We sent it back in again. So about 2 years, that process. Finally did what they asked, and they went, no, we don't want that anymore, thanks. And then we sent it to JBC, Journal of Biological Chemistry, which was lower impact factor, but it's a really solid journal that publishes great work in the field. And it basically got in straight away because we've done all the stuff a reviewer could ever ask for. And I think it's just as highly cited as it would have been in the other journal, but done in a far more transparent way, I think. It's not always easy to get into these higher impact journals. I also don't think necessary to some extent. There's still quite a hangover of you've got to have a Science, Cell, Nature type paper to have a career. I haven't got a Science, Cell, or a Nature paper. I've got a Nature Comms paper, which is in the Nature family, but I haven't got one of those top journal things. And yeah, you'd like to have one, but equally, there's an awful lot of good stuff published in journals that are notionally lower ranked. Like my go-to journal at the moment is BBA Biomembrains, and I said it because Ross isn't here and she's the editor of it. But they publish great stuff in my field with rigorous, helpful review processes, and that's what you want.
Yeah, I'd agree. I haven't ever even tried since I'm a PI to submit to a big journal. When I was a postdoc, we did for a while, and you've got to be really resilient and really, really want it, because there's a lot of rejection if you try going for the bigger journals. There's a lot of doing, as Alan said, a huge amount of extra work, and it's still not paying off. And then I guess it's the question of whether that's worth it on balance or not, or whether you should just get it out there for the wider community and allow you to move on and do the next step in your research. I like Biochem J as well. That's another favourite of mine.
Yep.
They're just good, solid, like, journals.
The stuff they publish is interesting and important.
Okay.
And maybe they're not like, oh, we're going to cure cancer, we're going to do whatever. But as a day-to-day biochemist, it's the sort of journal you would pick up and read because there's just good stuff in there.
Okay, so you don't think that the impact factor is the only factor when you select a journal?
I never use impact factor to select a journal.
Okay.
I make sure it's in the top quartile, if possible, to the top 25% of ranked journals in the field, just because that's one of the requirements for our ref. And to be honest, all the journals you think about publishing probably are in that top quartile anyway. But then I base it on what the journal likes to publish and what's in there, and does it fit with what they're going to publish. So if you literally had the hard copy of that journal article and you're flicking through, is it something you'd be interested in reading?
I think that's important, picking a journal that's interested in the topic that you're studying, because each journal will have its remit. And if you look on the web pages, it will tell you the kind of papers that it would like to publish. And I would always pick one where you fit firmly within the remit, rather than one where you're like, maybe, because it's just going to hit a bigger target audience. Now that everything's online, everyone can access everything easily. So the choice of journal isn't as important as it used to be. But I still think going with one that's like set up for what you do is a much better option.
I'd also say support society journals. So in my case, Biochemical Society and Microbiology Society, they have journal publishing arms, and they are generally relatively cheap to publish in, if not free. But the money they get for publishing feeds back into community activities, and try and stay away from predatory journals where you pay a huge amount of money to have it published with sometimes very low quality of peer review, sometimes no peer review. So I've been asked to review papers for particular journals where I've said absolutely not, it's dreadful, and then you get an email 2 days later saying, oh, we've accepted for publication without any changes.
Yeah, it's increasing.
Okay, interesting. I didn't know about this. It's good to know. And I also think that there's this, at least people mention that if you are in a university that is more famous, right? If you work at Cambridge, Oxford, if you work in Harvard, it's going to be more likely for you to publish in Nature Science and those better journals. Do you agree with that, or
do you mean just because of the university name, or do you mean?
Yeah, people think that the university name has a huge impact on this as well. I think
possibly subconsciously or possibly consciously in some people's case. I think there is an argument for doing double-blind peer review. It's really difficult because at the moment you don't know who the reviewers are, but they know who you are.
Okay.
It will be difficult to do because sometimes you can work out who it is because you know what they do. But there might be an advantage sometimes to taking the authors' names off the paper, so that you can review it more independently. I think there's a perceived advantage of being a better universities, air quotes, better university.
Exactly.
Aston's obviously the best university. But there's advantages to being there in terms of grants and papers, but I think there are now. I don't feel that since I've moved away from Oxford, but I find it harder to publish. Maybe harder to get grants, but maybe that's because I'm not very good. But you know, it's self-fulfilling in a way that people at those institutions tend to be very good researchers who deserve to have high impact papers, but there probably is some bias as well in there.
Maybe it's also easy for them to get money, so they can explore more in the lab.
And
connections.
really good researchers want to go and work for them.
And companies working with them, and better networking.
Yeah, and maybe less time teaching.
Yeah.
Okay.
That wasn't a complaint. I like teaching, but it is a realistic thing that takes up our time as well.
I have to admit that I think I was a bit unfair with my lectures back in the university, because I thought that they were not spending as much time as they should with us. But now I realize that how hard it is to be in your situation. You have a lot of responsibilities just for one role and not a great salary. And I admire people that can be organized and prioritize. And I admire your work. So this is, I don't know. I would say that this is really hard because you have a lot of tasks and a lot of responsibilities just for one role. And I believe that in other jobs, this is not as common. Okay, silent.
Get my small violin out for the academic.
So I apologize to all my lecturers because of it, if I wasn't fair. So let's go to the last question. Do you remember the first paper you wrote, or which one was like the most special for you and why? And
my first paper is around making a reporter strain in yeast, the one that turns blue when something happens in the environment. It's published in a journal called Yeast, appropriately enough. Back in the day when you did have like hard copies of journals. And I remember I wrote it and then I gave it to my supervisor, and I think he wrote more in red pen on the thing than I'd actually written in terms of the paper, because it wasn't great. It was my first attempt to write the paper. And then I think we faxed it off. A fax was like an email back in the day. Faxed it off to the journal, and they sent a fax back saying, yes, we've got it. And then they sent you a letter however many months later that said, congratulations, it's going to be published in Yeast. And then later on they send you hard copies of it, but they're not like A4 copies. They're weird journal size pages, so you can't put them anywhere. So I think my mum's got them all now in the house. But yeah, that probably is my most special paper. It's my first author paper that I at least wrote most. So I did all the experiments for it, and I did the submitting and the corrections, and got the letter that said congratulations, being published. And then they send you these nice glossy hard copy ones in black and white, obviously, because we can't afford to print in color, but black and white ones.
Oh.
So my first paper was based on the results of my undergrad project. I didn't really write the paper, but it did have all my data. I'd written it up as a project, and it had all my data in it. It went to the European Biophysics Journal. And until very recently, it was still my most highly cited paper. So that one was quite special because, I was a PhD student at the time I got published, but it was my undergrad project. After that, I think the one I'm probably most proud of is the first one I did as last author.
Okay.
So that was at Aston. And because I had done almost all the experiments for it as well. And it was the first time I was like supervising people as well and bringing in their stuff. So that was probably the other one I'm most proud of.
Good. It's good when you see that your work is being published and valued. It's really nice. I don't have any.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you will.
I have 3 to be published. The other 2 are from previous work. This takes years.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
I thought it would be easier.
I think that sums up science, doesn't it? I thought it would be easier.
Yeah, that's the feeling of a PhD student starting the PhD. Oh, I'm going to do this and this and this and this and this. No. Well, Alan, Alice, thank you very much for being here and for teaching us how to write scientific papers. And to our listeners, thank you very much for tuning in. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. Bye.